Okay, let's get started. Thanks everyone for joining another SDEC session. My name is Adam Greco, and I'll be kind of helping moderate behind the scenes. For those of you who are new to the SDEC, we are a free education community focused on folks in the digital marketing and digital analytics space. We cover about 12 topic areas. And if you're interested in being an official member of the SDEC, which is totally free, I'll be putting some information in the chat, in the Zoom chat, so that you can check it out. If you have questions for Ian as we're going through this session, you can use the Zoom Q&A and we'll go through all of those questions afterwards. So today's session, we have Ian Thomas, and I've worked with Ian back when he was at Microsoft and through the Digital Analytics Association, and one of the smartest people in our industry. So I'm very excited to have Ian on. And Ian recently, I guess not so recently anymore, but started a new role in the UK. But actually all over Europe and Africa, at a company called BetKing. And I thought it'd be really interesting to kind of hear how Ian kind of started, building his team from the ground up. So Ian, welcome to the SDEC. Thanks so much for presenting, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Adam. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me along. And yes, as you say, time flies because I've been at BetKing actually about 9 months now. Maybe even I can't keep track of how long I've been here. As you were saying, Adam, I have about a sort of 20-year history in the data analytics industry. Started out all the way back in 2000, co-founding a web analytics firm in the UK, then spent a good deal of time in the US in Seattle working for Microsoft for about 12 years or so in a number of data-focused roles, then a very short stint in Publicis Group in a chief data officer role there. And since the middle of last year, I have this role of VP of Data Analytics for BetKing. So what I wanted to do today was talk to you a little bit about the journey I've been on so far with BetKing, particularly as I've been looking to build out the team and the function. It's a pretty interesting opportunity because BetKing is a pretty kind of greenfield opportunity for creating the perfect data organization. Of course, no such thing exists, but certainly it presents a lot of opportunities to make decisions that might have been legacy decisions if I'd taken a job in a more established organization. So I'll give you a little bit of detail about BetKing. So BetKing is an Africa-based gaming betting company. We started, we're just almost exactly 3 years old, actually started just a little over 3 years ago, mostly in Nigeria, now operate in Kenya and Ethiopia as well, with growth plans across the rest of Africa, which I'll talk to in a second. It's a very profitable little, well, not so little business now, actually profitable, quite substantial business, and recently took a major round of investment from one of Africa's largest media companies, MultiChoice Group, to help expand the business and build strategic relationships with MultiChoice, which a bit like Sky in the UK, has a lot of sports broadcasting rights across all of Africa. Happily for me, with my Microsoft background, the company has an almost exclusively Microsoft technology platform, which has made my life a little bit easier in terms of learning about things. And as Adam alluded to, we're a highly distributed organization with operations in 3 countries, as I mentioned, but staff in 9 countries. Our tech team is in Malta. We have a training and data science team in Serbia. We have employees in South Africa, United Arab Emirates, London, significantly, as well as a few other spots. So we have really taken to being kind of on Zoom and Teams pretty much like a duck to water. And as I say, the company has rapid growth plans, both in terms of the countries we operate in and the new products that we want to launch across the kind of sort of gaming and betting sort of landscape. And we had some pretty interesting challenges that you would expect in running in Africa. There's pretty patchy internet in several of our target markets. I'm often on calls to my team members in Lagos, and their internet just goes out because there's a heavy rainstorm, which is pretty interesting. That means that, but also our customers have to deal with very low bandwidth requirements for some of the products that they use. It's a very fragmented and opaque regulatory environment as well. So data protection, for example, is varies in terms of laws across the continent. It's a completely mobile-first environment, and there's lots of feature phones still being used by people. And in fact, to that end, here's some numbers that one of our team members presented to the leadership team just the other day around the devices that we have. And as you can see, I don't know how up you are with your identification of African flags, but the top one here is Nigeria, and the second one down is Kenya, and the third is Ethiopia. And you can see in Kenya, a full 48% of our users are on feature phones. So some pretty interesting technology challenges and sort of operating challenges, which was one of the things that attracted me to the business in the first place. So when we think about data at BetKing, when I arrived in June 2020, there were a few small pieces in place. There was a small BI team based in Nigeria of just 3 people, and a small kind of data science team, but really an analytics team in Serbia of 4 people. And then our core product engineering is based in Malta. We had no digital or marketing analytics function at all. We did have Google Analytics in place, but nobody really running it. And then some DBA and cloud ops capability within the central engineering team. And the core product data infrastructure, and I won't go too much into the details on the tech in this call because we've just run out of time, but it's interesting, the Microsoft platform a little bit long in the tooth, very much kind of, although it's a cloud native company, a little bit of a legacy of sort of on-prem in the cloud, if you like, lots of infrastructure as a service, sort of big old VMs running SQL Server. And that's a legacy that we're still kind of working our way through. But the brief was to build a new centralized data team to grow with the business and to build a data analytics platform that could grow with the business, as we have to say these significant expansion from being primarily a Nigeria-based business to being an international business. So the approach that I've taken, and I'll talk about some of the challenges and so on as we go through this, is to build a new data team in London. And you may ask, well, why London if the company is doing most of its business in Africa? Why London? Well, firstly, there's a lot of betting and gaming experience in the UK, so we have a lot of our senior leadership team here, and of course, London is a great market for hiring tech talent. It's not cheap, but on the other hand, their supply is good, and that's an interesting. We thought about should we hire in. We tried to hire tech data talent in Malta. Well, Malta might be a bit cheaper, but it's a small pool of people. And similarly, should we build a data team in, say, Nigeria? Well, Nigeria is a lot cheaper, but equally, it's even harder to find good tech talent. And so we decided to consolidate to London, and then really scale out the data footprint rapidly. So modernize the current data and BI platform, integrate digital analytics into the broader picture. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then really, the sort of fairly standard playbook, if you like, is to make sure we publish self-serve data sets to enable self-sufficiency. I'm a bit of a stickler about this. I've spoken to so many people where they've generated a huge amount of tech debt by essentially building a data warehouse and then just tons of sort of one-off analytic solutions on the back of that that then have to be cleaned up later. And so what I really wanted to do is try and build something that scales from the get-go. That has created its own set of challenges from a recruiting and progress point of view, and I'll touch on those in a second. We want to extend the surface area of those tools to both business users, analytic users, and data science users, and of course have the platform scale for future growth as well. So the challenges were really in terms of building the teams, who to recruit first, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the next couple of slides. There's there's a bit of chicken and egg. If you say, okay, well, look, I need to build a data platform and I need to have a bunch of people who can do smart things with that data platform, then you have to decide whether to build one versus, which one's going to come first. And because, of course, if you go off and say, I'm going to build a data platform and it's going to take me 6 months to build this amazing data platform, then in the meantime, you've got all these angry users who can't get answers. If you go to the other extreme, you create a different set of challenges. But other things that I have had to kind of think about as I grow out the team is hiring leaders versus doers. And it's tempting when you're trying to build a team quickly to say, well, I'm going to hire people who can then themselves go on and hire other people. But I took the view that if you hire a bunch of leaders, then you could be 3 or 4 or 5 months into your hiring frenzy, and you still don't have anybody who can actually write code or actually do a piece of analysis. And so I've tilted over towards more hiring doers, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then which stakeholders to make happy first. Our business has an online element. It also has a retail element. So we have a lot of agents, independent agents in Nigeria who function essentially as franchisees. So there's a whole piece of the business there and analytics there, which we need to do. We have to figure out what we're doing with our marketing. We have to figure out a lot of stuff to do with payments and the kind of operational side of the business, because as I say, the markets we operate in are challenging. And so deciding which stakeholders to keep happy first has been a key challenge as well. And then, crucially, prioritizing hiring versus doing the job. And yes, I know I have to keep telling myself that hiring is doing the job, but as anybody who's kind of interested in data, particularly on the more technical end of the spectrum, will probably attest to, once you come in somewhere and there's lots of interesting sort of techie things to do, it can be very easy to get sucked down into the weeds and not step back and say, no, I need to hire people to do this stuff. And so that's been a battle. I had to make a real strong New Year's resolution to really dedicate probably nearly 50% of my time to just hiring people. That's lessened a bit in the last few weeks, but it's been a significant undertaking to try and grow the team rapidly. So the approach I've taken was to first, essentially, this is more or less stepwise, and I'm only about at step 2.5 of this. So, come back in a year and I'll tell you whether I actually kept to this plan or not. But the first step was to flesh out the data engineering team in London. One of the decisions we made is that we didn't really want to build out a lot of data engineers in Nigeria, partly because of this the talent acquisition issue. So ultimately, we want to sort of to shake down and ramp down that Nigeria team and build in London. But we need to have data engineers there to start building out the platform. So we've got a small kind of tiger team of data engineers that I've hired. Essentially, it's kind of three or four core people in London who are now building out the data warehouse and the analysis services on top of that. And then the second piece was to plug some key analytics and data science gaps, kind of based on a noisy stakeholder approach. There's also some other things we're managing for as the business grows, how we think about our trading function. Trading is a very important part of a gaming business because that's how you settle your prices for the games you're offering odds on and so on. And there's a lot of data that goes in there and things like predictive analysis. So we're moving more quickly than you might expect to hire data scientists because there's that work for them. We even though the rest of the team is relatively small, we actually already have one data scientist for trading on board and another joining in a few weeks' time. And we need to kind of de-risk this Serbia team we have, which again is a team that we may find moves away in due course. And then number 3, which is the easier said than done piece, is to sort of scale data engineering and analytics in parallel. So to try and keep those things in some kind of lockstep so that as we unlock more ability to do analytics, we have the ability to productionize that analytics into engineered assets in the kind of the data portfolio, data platform. And number 4 is probably was not originally how I thought about things, but now I'm sort of more or less committed to bringing in leadership as the team becomes too large to manage. Initially, my instinct was like, oh, I need to get a data engineering senior data engineering manager in to manage all the data engineers. But actually, and that will happen, but I don't think we're at that point yet. So my approach is to have the leadership be not the last thing to be hired, but to come in when it's really necessary, when I'm really stretched across sort of too many people directly. And then number 5, and here we're not talking about maybe something that's quite so strictly sequential, because things like governance and privacy are important, and I'm planning to hire a governance lead fairly soon, actually, and probably in the next few months, because as I mentioned, we have quite a complex governance picture in the African markets in which we operate, and you should do data governance anyway, particularly when you're running a gambling business, because this is a place where people are spending a lot of money in a potentially sensitive area, and so you need to be really good about taking care of that data and identifying things like problematic behavior and so on. And so just a couple of sort of kind of tiny little bits of sort of deep dive on a couple of these points. I put together this. I feel like I should have some diagrams in this slide deck. So put together this about the challenge of growing your platform versus growing your analytics capability. I described this the other day to somebody. It's a bit like somebody says, I need you to produce cars. You can either hire an army of people to build cars from almost from scratch and beat the metal themselves, or you can spend a bunch of time building a factory to produce cars. And if you go extreme on one end or the other, then you either end up with somebody waiting for 2 years for a factory to be built, or a bunch of people who are just building the same thing over again in a very laborious way. And so if you have a platform but no analysts, then it might be sitting there, but you haven't got the skills in the organization to take advantage of the platform. If you have lots of analysts but no platform, apart from anything else, you're building up a ton of tech debt, because what you will have is a bunch of people who will solve their own problems. They'll get the data somehow. I mean, the data is all there in our core product platform, and they'll then build their own homegrown, ETLs and data models and so on. And before you know it, you've got as many different data models as you have analysts. So very much my goal is to try and build those things somewhat in lockstep. And that's been quite challenging. We started, as I mentioned a second ago, to try to get the core platform elements in place. That's left us a bit behind the curve, or behind the 8 ball on analytics capabilities. So I'm now trying to fill that gap a little bit more. But on the other hand, it means that people can self-serve more easily, which is helping to sort of lighten the load a little bit. And then when I think about there's a relationship, of course, between the roles and the platform pieces that we're building out. And this is fairly sort of straightforward stuff, I suppose. But it shows you kind of how I tend to think about sort of some of the roles that we are hiring for. So we have this sort of spectrum left to right of, as it were, the sort of the lower portion of the platform, all based on data lake, and we use Azure Databricks and so on, through to our data warehouse, analysis services we use in Azure quite a lot, Power BI, as well as Google Analytics and BigQuery, where we're sourcing our GA data from, because we have GA360 now. And so at the left end, you've got your data engineers, and as you move sort of further up the stack, if you like, you've got sort of analytics engineer or BI engineer, which is for me a distinct role. The way I distinguish between these is data engineers are most interested and excited by sort of infrastructural data coding. So they really like to make a nice, well-managed pipeline that moves data through in an efficient fashion and has got good monitoring and quality and all that kind of more plumbing kind of stuff. The analytics engineer is less interested in that and much more interested in data modeling and turning sort of business reality into sort of dimensionality and measures within the data. A technical analyst is good at creating, ad hoc analytics and so on, and sort of coming at that data modeling question from the other end, from the analytical questions end. And then of course you've got your sort of business analyst or stakeholders who are largely should be assumed as sort of non-technical. And as you can see from this diagram, these are all designed to highlight the fact that these all overlap. And then you've got your data scientist role, which I was struggling to find an elegant way of diagramming this, but I just ended up with this sort of, sausage here, which sort of goes across these three areas, where they dip into data engineering, certainly do, analysis, and they're doing this kind of very sort of model-driven analytics work across these. And so this dotted line sort of highlights where I've been spending, where we've sort of had most of our engineering, engineering and analyst hiring be focused initially. That will grow out more towards the left-hand end in the coming months. We've been putting people in place who sort of stretch into this really core data engineering work as we build out a more scalable platform. And so a thought on what I've dubbed sort of platform talent determinacy. What I mean by that is the platform we're using is a strong determinant of the kind of people you attract. It was very interesting when we started to hire people for our Microsoft, our Azure-based environment, because going back to this diagram, Microsoft's BI, as many of you may know, has been incredibly strong for years in this kind of this sort of data warehouse analysis services kind of world, building cubes and setting up self-serve BI. And call me old-fashioned, but there's still a lot of value in that, and we're making good use of that. But there's this newer world of scaled data management in a lake environment, and then surfacing that lake data through to analytical tools without having a huge, heavy-duty sort of ETL and data modeling activity. And historically, although that is all very well catered for in the Azure platform, that is something that you tend to find people coming along and they say, oh, yes, I've been using, Amazon Kinesis or S3 to do this, or I've been using BigQuery on Google, which kind of functions as a kind of a data lake house. And of course, things like Snowflake are well into that sort of category as well. So it was interesting when we spoke to, as we've been speaking to engineers for the Azure environment, that we've ended up with a lot of, we've spoken to a lot of people who are very sort of lodged in that very sort of SQL Server kind of world, and have had trouble kind of seeing a little bit outside of that world. And so fortunately, we've managed to get some good people who really want to stretch into the more sort of modern ETL models and the data lake and so on. But that has been an interesting struggle, particularly at senior levels, because you find the senior people are people who, often there's somebody who's like, oh, I spent 20 years doing SQL database administration. You're like, that maybe not exactly the profile that we need. And then just to comment on sort of people versus roles, and many of you will know what I'm talking about here. Of course, not of course, but we've hired, we've been hiring against defined roles. It's important. Obviously, you can publish a job description and tell people what the job is, because otherwise people are like, what is this? But as we've met candidates, we've adjusted our expectations and thought more about how, tried to fit the responsibilities a bit more to the individuals. And we made two sort of double offers. We had two final candidates for data engineering, and we offered both of them. And we had two candidates for data science. We've offered both of them because we felt they were good people that could help us evolve the organization we're building as much as as much as being shaped by it. When you're starting more or less from scratch, your team is defined by the people that you hire anyway. So there's no point forcing people into buckets when we're still trying to figure out how everybody fits together. And then the bonus challenge, of course, has been doing everything remotely. So I've hired 7 people in the last 6 months. 4 of them in the last month, actually. So it's been a real burst in the last few weeks. I've only met one of them in person, and then only for 2 hours, I think. And just a couple of quick reflections on that in terms of hiring entirely remotely. But firstly, it's been much easier to schedule interviews, both for candidates and for us. It has an effect. Just get my notice that whereas before you could never get a candidate to do a 2 p.m. interview on a Thursday, because what they were going to do, just like leave the office and randomly go to, you know, to an interview across the country or in a different city or whatever, even somewhere else in the same city, to do an interview. But if you do it remotely, they can just block it out in their diary and hey presto, you've got an interview slot. It's also been easier for us as well to be able to move people through the process, because we haven't had to sort of orchestrate a whole bunch of people to be in the office on the same day or do that whole thing and have the candidate repeatedly coming back in and so on for people's availability. It's also been something of a leveler, I think. I mean, I know there's been a lot of talk about the intrusiveness of Zoom in people's homes and so on, and the fact that sometimes people don't have a very quiet place to do interviews from. So that's something to bear in mind. But on the other hand, it's actually made for me sort of the whole kind of sort of visual aspect, frankly, of interviewing just a lot less important. And I'll have a comment about that in the sort of the diversity comment about the bottom. But I think it's been a little bit of a leveler as well. On the downside, it's felt risky to me to offer senior roles for somebody I've never met. And that has been something a bit more interesting. I think that's maybe needs a bit more of a considered approach than I've been taking. I've been doing this sort of more, this sort of heavy hell for leather kind of trying to build the team out. Partly I feel that's because it's harder to assess cultural fit when you're doing things remotely. And it's one thing to have, hiring a data engineer for their core technical skills and so on. As long as they're not, don't come across as a, sociopath, then you're probably in okay shape. But cultural fit at the more senior levels is super important, and it's been harder to assess that. I also feel like there's been a little bit less buy-in from candidates because, again, they haven't had the other side of that, of sort of going to somebody's office, like seeing the team and getting a kind of sense of the thing. And as a result, we have had some people bailing late in the process, even after accepting jobs, which has been annoying, and black marks in my book. And then onboarding has been more, needs more attention, because if you onboard somebody in their own home, then it can be challenging for them in the first week or 2 weeks because they may not have very much to do and they're just kind of sitting there. Whereas if you bring people on in the office, you can walk them around and take them to lunch and do all that sorts of things, and they have the sort of just the psychological feeling of like, oh, I'm going to my new job and it's all interesting and that sort of thing. Whereas just somebody sitting in their office can be on in their home rather. And I've had to make it clear to candidates that they basically shouldn't feel bad if they're just sitting there and they don't feel like they've got very much to do in the first few days. And shipping laptops around the country has been, it's not that bad, but it's, an extra complexity to get people set up remotely and that sort of thing. And then the interesting piece about it actually is I feel like it's had a possible beneficial impact on diversity. I don't want to kind of overextend this, and I say it's a little bit perhaps connected to the sort of the leveler aspect of this. We're depending on how you view it, actually, viewed from my perspective, we're an innately very diverse company because we've got, half of our company is based in Nigeria and so on. I made a commitment early on to hire a diverse team that reflected our customers in the UK. And I'm pleased actually managed to I've got a couple of my first hires were actually Nigerian nationals here in the UK, which was really nice. And so I feel like there are some aspects of hiring remotely, as I say, being more flexible around people's schedules, not requiring people to show up at odd times when they may have other stuff going on in their lives and so on. I think has possibly made it easier to be a bit more sort of neutral about about other aspects of people's lives, which after all shouldn't really factor into into your decision to make an offer to somebody. On the other hand, as I say, we could be, I think, interviewing people remotely, is harder for some people than being in person. It requires people to kind of show up a little bit more online and so on, and that's maybe creates some pressure elsewhere. But it's certainly been interesting, and it's left me with the feeling that I would instinctively rely more on remote interviewing for more of the hiring process going forward, and then sort of mix in more in person later in the process. So so you can get to more or less a kind of cultural vet point and then do that more in person. So you have that to complement what is otherwise a fairly efficient remote process. So miraculously, I've managed to more or less keep the time I planned to for this. So we have a little bit of time for questions. Happy to expand on any of the things I just sort of raced through, either on some of the technical side of things or the people side of things. I know we have some Q&A, so I'll just pop that open now.
Ian, I'll kind of help you here. But before you jump into answering questions, first of all, thank you so much. If anyone's on the call has questions for Ian, now is an opportune time for you to use the Zoom Q&A. Please use that over the chat. Makes it much easier for us. So Ian, the first question we had was, were you constrained by differing regulations for hiring and where you can operate?
Well, a little bit. I mean, it was certainly factored into our decision making that it can be harder to onboard people in certain locations. Once we'd decided that we wanted to build the team in London, then the good news is that London has been obviously a fairly easy place to hire people. It's been super interesting to me, frankly, to see the number, in the context of Brexit, the number of foreign nationals that we've hired. It's the majority. Interestingly, from almost exclusively from outside the UK, actually, but sorry, outside Europe, although we have seen plenty of candidates. So it hasn't constrained us yet, but there will at some point be a candidate that I really like, who's, I don't know, from Spain or something, and Brexit will make it harder to hire that person, and then I will write a stern letter to Boris Johnson or something. But so far, otherwise, it's been fairly smooth.
Okay. Next one. Is there any specific technical strategy you've taken to work towards a better NPS or customer sat score by ingesting data from external sources like social media, forums, mobile app reviews? Seems like there's definitely scope for improvement for BetKing. Sounds like someone may have used BetKing.
Well, yes. So it's one of the things that's on our roadmap. I mean, we do have we actually have some fairly well developed customer support functions, more so than you might imagine for a sort of very online business, because we have to handhold people through sort of quite a few basic things like deposits and withdrawals, just because that is complicated in Africa, and we do have our agent network. So we're engaged on a program to analyze more of that data and bring it into customer satisfaction understanding, and so it's a constant area of focus for us for sure.
Next question. On the tech stack, are you trying to move to more open source tools instead of being tied to Microsoft offerings? If not, why?
It's been an interesting conversation, actually. So we actually are actively looking at some open source projects. For example, Kafka is a key technology of interest for us. We handle a lot of high volume transactional data, and so ultimately we're going to need to be able to stream that around the organization. So rather than just use Azure Event Hub, then we're thinking Kafka. Similarly, we made the decision to use Databricks rather than Azure ML Studio. It's not an either or really, but Databricks has that sort of broader base within the industry and so on. We feel pretty happy about our relationship with Microsoft, but as you imply, we're keen to kind of have a strategy that doesn't make us completely beholden to Microsoft if that should ever go south. There are some pieces though, such as our sort of upper tier analytics and BI pieces around sort of analysis services, Power BI, and so on, where I'm sort of resigned to the fact that we're basically a Microsoft shop. I know that Microsoft have been doing this for years; they're not about to abandon it. But lower down in the technology stack, we do need the ability to to have a bit more of a multi-cloud approach, and open source is a part of that strategy for sure.
Okay. How is your team's performance graded, and who grades your team?
Well, that's one of the things that we're kind of inventing right now, because along with everything else, along with my team, we're rapidly building out essentially our whole operation in London. We hired a VP of people, she's actually based in Paris, because why not, I suppose, but she's sort of responsible, among other things, for our performance and performance and grading system across the company. So she's just building that out. And so we will be basing that on, really kind of the two axes of sort of what people have achieved in terms of impact, and how they have achieved that. And those two are very important for me. It's one, it's very important in technical roles, in my opinion and experience, that people don't just deliver results, but they deliver them in a sustainable way with regard to the organization, which is to say they don't basically just trample on everybody else to get their stuff done, but that they are, good partners to others in the organization. So we'll be really taking those two aspects into account.
Okay. Next question. What do you wish senior leaders, stakeholder or analyst, knew about data lakes and modern data architecture?
I think that probably the first thing I would say is that they should know that data lakes they're really just, big file systems with some, clever indexing and sort of viewing capabilities on top. In other words, there's nothing magical about data lakes. Because when I joined, the CTO, one of the first things he said to me is, Ian, you must explain to me what a data lake is. And I'm like, well, it's just stuff, it's just files, really. It felt like a really insufficient answer. They've been kind of bigged up by the industry to be this sort of amazing thing. And there's a lot of good stuff there. There's lots of interesting, there's lots of good innovation there, Parquet file and all sorts of stuff like that. But ultimately, it's not magic. But then on the other hand, the other thing I always explain to people is, just because you've got a ton of stuff in a data lake, it doesn't mean that you can magically extract all the insights you need easily. The creation of derived data assets from that underlying source data is still a supremely important activity. And I think, say the other side of the coin, people are just like, oh, we'll just have everything in data lake, point data scientists at it, and hey presto, all our questions will be answered. And that way lies sort of a lot of data, technical debt and challenges, because people end up solving the same issue 10 different ways.
Yep. So next question is, for hiring, how do you handle detailed technical interviewing and qualifications across such a wide range of skill sets, especially given that your strategy started with hiring more doers than leaders?
Yeah, so that has been an interesting challenge. I'm not a big fan of coding tests, ultimately, because I've struggled to find ones which really capture what people can do in a sort of real world environment. So what we mostly do, and we've been fortunate so far that it's worked out for us. Although the more people we have, the more ability we'll have to do this in a slightly more refined way, is to really just make sure that the people we're hiring for, are spending time with the best people in our organization who have those skill sets, who can ask those more detailed technical questions. That said, we have for our data science hires, and for actually for some of our analyst hires, particularly one in particular, we have started asking people to deliver a presentation. And for me, that actually can be quite a good way. The data science one was interesting because we didn't have anybody who had enough data science depth in the organization to start quizzing somebody about, random forest algorithms, or, principal component analysis or whatever. but what I strongly believe about data scientists is that they should be able to explain their ideas clearly to people who are not technical. And so we had the data science candidates come and deliver presentations about their work. And that was very, very useful in understanding that they could actually talk about what they were doing in a way that was intelligible. Interestingly, with one of our analyst hires, we had him come and we gave him some data and said, can you just have a look over this data and just pull out some interesting relationships in it. This was not an incredibly technical analyst job, but it was somebody who expected to be able to sort of, pivot around the data and do some, pull out some relationships. And he absolutely crashed and burned, mostly because he didn't spend enough time on the task. And I don't expect people to spend days on these tasks, which is very important. I think it's very unfair to ask people to spend, 8 hours on a technical grading task. It's basically kind of free work. It feels a bit exploitative. But this guy was like, oh, I only had an hour for this because I've been busy. And he did a terrible job. But it was made our job very easy because we basically kicked him to the curb because he didn't put the time in to look at the data properly.
Yeah. And I know some companies I've heard are even moving to a model where if they do expect someone to spend 3 or 4 hours on a task, they're actually paying them so that they don't feel they're exploiting them. Next question, what's your biggest pain point with analytics operations? For example, is it the time from request to report or analysis, or is it storytelling, or is there something else that's your biggest kind of pain point?
Yeah, those are all quite good pain points actually, which do resonate with me. Probably the biggest pain point at the moment is sufficient business context depth within our really currently very small analyst team, because we've got sort of a couple of analysts, one of whom is really a BI engineer, but she can do analysis as well, and then one data scientist really, and then this external team, well not external, but this other team in the organization. And so one of the things that's highest priority for me is to build out that team a little bit and make sure they have the business context so that they can take a brief. Right now, far too much stuff is passing through me, and that's slowing down our ability to answer questions in a timely fashion. And as I said before, I strongly believe that analysis should be the kind of on-ramp to regular sort of reporting and insights, meaning that you should always be thinking when you're doing analysis about whether that would be a repeatable piece of work. And it may not be, and not all analysis can be, but it should always be in the back of one's mind. And so I try and take this sort of slightly more platformized version approach to it. And I still stand by it, but it definitely does sort of create agility, an agility penalty, if you like, if you're thinking about that when you're doing that.
Okay, one last question. How did you decide which positions deserved the most resources, but like budget-wise?
In terms of how much we're paying people,
I think they were more like, how did you decide which positions you wanted to do first, or it may be also like of all the budget you have, where did you decide to kind of place that money?
Yeah. Well, as I say, there are certain parts of our business which, I mean, there's fairly obvious to say this, I suppose, but our CEO has given quite a good steer on the areas that he's super interested in. The core, and then as I've got to know the business myself a bit better, it's become clearer to me where some of the, where the sausage is made, or it's not the right analogy, but where the money is made in our business. So one of those areas, for example, is in the whole core sort of trading and pricing piece, because if you when you're talking about sports betting, if you can offer people great odds on a game, and that might get a lot of people to bet on that game. If they lose that bet, then hurrah, you did a great thing because you offered good odds, you got people to bet, and and then you just pocketed the money. If they win, you're out of pocket a lot by offering great odds. And so there's a balance there between what we call trading, the pricing of the book as it's known, to attract good customers and so on. And that's a complex area where there's a lot of money to be made if you get the pricing right. And our current trading function has been a little, um, it's based in Serbia, and it's very focused on, it's got a lot of expertise focused on the European market, and we need more expertise in the Africa market. And so we have a VP or head of trading in London now who's really pushing on insights to get a more Africa-oriented set of insights. So we've focused quite a lot of effort on helping him with people, because that's also a longer run activity to build up those models and so on over time. And then the other key one where we're spending a ton of money is marketing. We're spending quite a lot of money on marketing, very little attributable reporting on that at the moment. There's some good, if technical, platform reasons for that, or they're not good reasons, but they're important reasons. And so that's another area where I've focused my energies, because that's where you can turn around and really help our VP of marketing by helping him demonstrate that the money he's spending is money well spent.
Okay, awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much. We had a couple people ask if they could check out your slides. So if you can, maybe PDF those and shoot that to me in Measure Slack, and I'll put it in our SDEC Slack. But Ian, thank you so much. This was awesome.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for the great questions. Really enjoyed the time.
Okay, everyone have a great rest of the week. Thanks so much.
Thanks everybody.